Erica Thompson stood in the courthouse, her heels clicking on the polished floor, her mind still racing from the events leading up to this moment. The broken taillight on her car was a small issue, but for her, it was a hassle she couldn't afford to deal with. Not today. She had just wrapped up a long, draining week of meetings and paperwork for her job as a federal advocate for equal opportunities, working tirelessly behind the scenes to fight for fairness and equality. Yet here she was, caught up in the web of a legal system that she knew all too well was far from equal. As she entered the courtroom, she took a deep breath and composed herself. Her professional appearance, smart, confident, and calm, was a shield she always wore. Today, it was more important than ever. The case was straightforward, a minor traffic violation. Still, Erica felt a flicker of unease as she walked to the defendant's table. She knew the system was not always kind to people like her, even for the smallest infractions. The faces of those who'd come before the court before her were filled with resignation, their experiences often marked by unfair treatment. Judge William Morris was already seated, his stern eyes scanning the room as he adjusted his glasses. He was a man who prided himself on order and discipline. His reputation as a no-nonsense, traditional judge was well known throughout the city. The kind of judge who believed in strict adherence to the law and a firm hand in the courtroom. Erica had read about him. His decisions were respected, but also seen by some as uncompromising. This, however, was a minor case, something that shouldn't require much deliberation. "Miss Thompson," Judge Morris said, his voice deep and authoritative, his gaze never leaving the papers in front of him. "You're here for a violation of Vehicle Code 237. Failure to maintain proper lighting on your vehicle. Is that correct?" Erica nodded, trying to remain composed despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. She had hoped to resolve this quickly, perhaps with a simple warning, but she wasn't so sure now. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm. The judge looked up, his expression unreadable. "Your violation carries a fine of $250. Are you prepared to pay?" Erica's heart skipped a beat. She had expected a fine, of course, but this seemed unnecessarily harsh for something so minor. She thought of the bills waiting to be paid, the work she still had to finish, and the last thing she needed was another financial burden. "I understand, Your Honor," she said slowly, gathering her words carefully. "But given my circumstances, I was hoping for some leniency. It's a minor issue, and I've already taken steps to fix the taillight." The judge didn't respond immediately. He didn't even glance up from the paperwork. His lips pressed into a thin line, as if her words didn't warrant more than a passing acknowledgement. Erica could feel her frustration rising. She had hoped for understanding, some recognition that this wasn't a deliberate violation, but an unfortunate oversight. Judge Morris cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice cold and detached. "This court is not in the habit of giving out leniency for violations of the law, Miss Thompson. The fine stands." The words hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't just a defendant in this moment. She was a woman trying to be heard, a person who had worked for years to fight for justice, only to feel silenced by a system she was committed to improving. She nodded, swallowing her irritation. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, before turning to leave. But as she stepped down from the stand, a quiet determination took root in her chest. She would pay the fine, of course, but this wouldn't be the last time her voice would be heard. Judge William Morris sat back in his high-backed chair as the courtroom cleared, the sound of his gavel echoing softly in the empty space. He was a man who valued order above all else. His decisions were methodical, precise, and always in line with the law. Over the years, he had cultivated a reputation for being unwavering, especially when it came to maintaining discipline in his courtroom. The law, he believed, was black and white, and his duty was to enforce it without emotion or favoritism. As he signed off on the last of the day's cases, his mind returned to Erica Thompson. Her case had been simple, straightforward even, but something about her response had lingered in his mind. She had seemed so composed, so self-assured. Not the typical reaction he expected from someone facing a fine, especially one of her background. There was no anger, no outburst, just a quiet resignation. Judge Morris glanced at the calendar on his desk, mentally moving through the rest of the cases he had scheduled for the week. He had a busy few days ahead, but that moment with Erica nagged at him. What had she said? Something about circumstances. He didn't remember the exact words, but it was clear she was trying to convince him that her minor violation didn't warrant the full penalty. To him, however, that didn't matter. The law was clear. Any violation of vehicle codes, no matter how small, deserved its due consequence. It was a matter of consistency. Leniency, he muttered to himself as he scribbled his signature across the final document. It was a word that didn't belong in his world. Over the years, he had become convinced that giving leeway would create chaos. Every time he had bent the rules for one person, there seemed to be someone else ready to take advantage of it. And in his eyes, fairness didn't mean treating everyone the same. It meant applying the law equally to all. That was the foundation of justice. He shuffled the papers on his desk and found himself thinking back to his own upbringing. He had grown up in a family where discipline was everything. Rules weren't questioned, and respect was earned, not given. His father, a retired police officer, had instilled in him a strong sense of duty, a belief that justice was not up for negotiation. It had been this very mindset that propelled him into a successful career on the bench. The idea that law enforcement and judicial decisions should never be swayed by personal biases had always driven his work. As the day drew to a close, Judge Morris leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head. He felt a sense of satisfaction in the work he had done today. The system was working, he believed, and he was simply doing his part to keep things running smoothly. The case of Erica Thompson was nothing more than another routine matter, an example of the law being followed to the letter. But in the back of his mind, something still felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had allowed himself to see. Erica Thompson was more than just the woman who had appeared before Judge Morris that day. To most people, she was simply a civil servant, an advocate fighting for justice and equal opportunities. But her role as a federal official was far from ordinary. She worked as a senior consultant at the Department of Justice, a position that placed her at the heart of national reform efforts. For years, Erica had been a key player in reshaping policies that affected underserved communities, working to ensure that legal systems across the country provided equitable treatment for everyone, regardless of race or background. Her work was often invisible to the public eye, but that didn't bother her. Erica preferred to stay out of the spotlight, focusing instead on the quieter, but no less critical, aspects of her job. She was the one who spent countless hours drafting legislation, attending high-level meetings with lawmakers, and strategizing with experts on how to dismantle discriminatory practices within the justice system. She was the one who made sure those in power didn't forget the marginalized voices that often went unheard. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who had devoted her career to ensuring fairness, facing a seemingly trivial fine over a broken taillight, an issue that, in the grand scheme of things, hardly seemed worth the time of the courtroom. Yet, the very system she had fought so hard to improve had treated her with indifference. She couldn't help but think back to Judge Morris's cold dismissal. Had he even considered her background before handing down the fine? Erica had tried to explain her circumstances in court, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the judge hadn't truly listened. There had been no acknowledgement of her work, no recognition of her efforts to create a more just system. Instead, her voice had been lost in the shuffle of routine legal procedure. As she left the courthouse, she knew she couldn't let the moment go without making her point. It wasn't about the fine. It was about the deeper issues at play. Erica was aware of how the system often failed to recognize the contributions of people like her, people who weren't just passing through, but working every day to change the rules of the game. She knew this wasn't a battle she could win by herself, but if she could make the right people listen, perhaps the next time something like this happened, it wouldn't be so easy to dismiss. In her office later that evening, Erica sat at her desk and began drafting a formal letter. She wasn't going to let this slip by unnoticed. If the judge hadn't understood who she was when she was in his courtroom, she would make sure he knew now. She carefully outlined her concerns about the case and the wider implications of judicial decision-making in an unequal system, highlighting the need for fairness not only in theory, but in practice. She wouldn't be the only one who would hear about this. She would make sure of that. Weeks passed before Erica's letter about the courtroom incident with Judge Morris was even acknowledged. Life, as it often did, carried on. Erica continued her tireless work in Washington, meeting with colleagues, writing policy papers, and advocating for equal treatment within the legal system. She had made her point, and now, as far as she was concerned, the matter was closed. Or so she thought. One chilly morning, as Erica sat at her desk in her office at the Department of Justice, a thick envelope arrived in her inbox. The return address was unfamiliar, and the subject line read simply, "Response to your complaint." A knot of curiosity tightened in her stomach. She hadn't expected any follow-up, certainly not this soon. A part of her had even wondered if her concerns had been brushed aside, dismissed like so many others before her. But there it was, an official-looking letter, one that seemed to carry some weight. She opened it carefully, unfolding the crisp paper inside. As she read, her eyebrows furrowed in surprise. The letter was from the Judicial Oversight Committee. It stated that her complaint regarding the fine imposed by Judge Morris had not only been received, but was being formally reviewed. The letter mentioned that an internal investigation was underway, and that her concerns would be taken into account in future discussions regarding courtroom fairness and legal practices. It wasn't just a simple acknowledgement. This was something more. Erica's initial surprise quickly gave way to a quiet sense of satisfaction. Maybe her voice had been heard after all. But as she continued reading, something else caught her attention. The letter referred to her personal and professional background, her work with the Department of Justice, her contributions to various equal opportunity initiatives, and her active role in fighting for systemic change. It wasn't a boastful mention, but it was enough to let her know that they knew who she was. At first, Erica wasn't sure what to think about the mention of her federal role. On one hand, she was pleased that her work had been recognized. On the other, she couldn't help but feel a bit exposed. Had the system, which often overlooked her efforts, only paid attention now because of her position? She wasn't sure how to feel about that. But there was no denying it. This wasn't just a random case anymore. Her complaint had created a ripple, one that would undoubtedly reach beyond the walls of the courtroom. As she placed the letter down on her desk, Erica leaned back in her chair, deep in thought. She hadn't expected this to snowball. What would this mean for Judge Morris? How would he respond when he realized who he had dismissed so easily? More importantly, what would this mean for the larger conversation about how people like her were treated within the very system they worked to improve? One thing was certain. This was only the beginning. Judge William Morris was reviewing a stack of case files when he came across an unexpected notification. A profile of Erica Thompson had crossed his desk. It was part of an internal review he had been asked to examine after a complaint was filed regarding one of his recent rulings. As he skimmed the document, he noticed something that immediately caught his attention: Erica's role in federal advocacy. She wasn't just any citizen. She was a senior official working within the Department of Justice. His initial reaction was one of surprise. How could I have missed this? He thought, staring at the words on the page. He had heard of Erica Thompson before, but only in passing, never associating the name with a face or a particular case. In truth, he had been so focused on the small details of his daily routine that he hadn't thought much about the lives and stories behind the names before him in the courtroom. Erica's name had come up as part of a routine traffic violation case, and he had dismissed her, just as he did with many others. But now, seeing her credentials, he was struck by how little he had known about the woman who had stood before him. The more he read, the clearer it became that Erica was not just an ordinary public servant. She was an influential leader in the fight for equal treatment within the justice system. Her work focused on reforming policies that affected underserved communities, advocating for fairness in legal proceedings, and challenging systems of oppression. The sheer breadth of her contributions had earned her accolades from legal experts and policymakers alike. It hit him like a wave. He had found someone with a powerful, far-reaching influence without even realizing who she truly was. Judge Morris sat back in his chair, his mind racing. How did I not see this? He asked himself. His earlier confidence in his ruling now felt misplaced, and he felt a deep sense of discomfort. In his effort to apply the law without any leniency, had he inadvertently reinforced the very inequalities Erica had been fighting against her entire career? It wasn't that he had acted out of malice. He had simply followed the rules, as he always had. But now, with a greater understanding of who Erica was, he began to question whether there had been a moment for compassion or consideration beyond the strict application of the law. Could there have been a different path to take, one that acknowledged her position and the broader implications of his decision? Judge Morris began to realize that the small decisions in his courtroom could have rippling effects beyond what he had ever imagined. In this instance, his simple ruling had intersected with the work of someone actively changing the system he had worked within for decades. He felt conflicted, unsure of how to move forward, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just ignore the weight of what he had learned. There was only one way to address this, a personal reckoning, one that might lead to change, not just for Erica, but for the way he would approach every case from that moment on. Judge Morris spent the next several days in quiet reflection, replaying the moment he had encountered Erica Thompson in his courtroom. The fine he had imposed on her seemed small in comparison to the broader implications of his decision. As he delved deeper into his thoughts, the discomfort he had initially felt grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed someone important. He had always prided himself on being a fair and impartial judge, but now, that certainty felt flawed. What troubled him the most wasn't just the fine. It was his inability to see Erica as more than a defendant, more than just a name on a docket. In his rush to uphold the law, he had dismissed her context, her work, and her role in the very system he was sworn to protect. It became clear that a simple apology wouldn't be enough. If he was to reconcile with his own values and the ideals of justice he had spent a lifetime defending, he needed to acknowledge his mistake in a more meaningful way. He composed a letter to Erica, one that would not only apologize for his misjudgment, but also express his desire to understand her perspective. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, careful not to leave anything unsaid. Dear Ms. Thompson, the letter began, I am writing to you with deep regret regarding my recent ruling in your case. Upon learning more about your professional background and your important work in the field of equal justice, I realize that I failed to give due consideration to the larger context of your case. As a judge, I strive to maintain fairness in all my decisions, yet I now see that I overlooked an opportunity to approach your situation with the understanding and respect it deserved. For that, I sincerely apologize. He paused for a moment, weighing the next few words. The apology needed to be more than a mere formality. It needed to convey his genuine desire to make amends. I would like to invite you to meet with me in person. The letter continued. I believe there is much I can learn from your perspective, and I would appreciate the opportunity to listen and understand your experience. I would be honored if you would accept this invitation, as I am committed to ensuring that future cases are approached with the full awareness of the broader picture, especially in cases like yours, where systemic issues may not always be immediately visible. He signed the letter with a sense of purpose and sealed it, knowing it would be the first step in a longer process of transformation, not just for Erica and himself, but for the way justice was practiced in his courtroom. The next morning, he sent the letter, hoping that Erica would see this as a genuine effort to mend the gap that had formed between them. As the days passed, Judge Morris couldn't help but feel a weight lift off his shoulders. The apology, though uncomfortable, had been necessary. It wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about ensuring that his future decisions were grounded in a deeper understanding of the complexities that shaped the people who walked into his courtroom. A week after receiving Judge Morris's letter, Erica sat in her office, the letter now resting on her desk in front of her. She had read it several times, each time feeling the weight of the words. It wasn't every day that a judge took the initiative to acknowledge a mistake, especially one with such a high profile. It was rare, almost unheard of, for someone in the judiciary to take responsibility for an error in judgment. And it wasn't just any mistake. It was a failure to recognize her as more than just a defendant, as more than just a woman caught in the gears of a system she spent her life working to improve. Erica paused, thinking about her options. She could ignore the letter, brush it aside as a formal gesture meant to save face, or she could respond, acknowledging the apology and use the opportunity to speak about the very thing she had been fighting for all these years: fairness, empathy, and the need for a more human approach to justice. But there was something about the tone of the letter that stopped her from dismissing it. The sincerity was clear, and Erica, ever the advocate for dialogue, believed that if there was any chance to shift the course of her previous interaction with Judge Morris, it lay in an honest conversation. She picked up the phone, dialing the number at the bottom of the letter. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism running through her. When the line clicked, she introduced herself and scheduled the meeting, agreeing to meet him the following week at his chambers. When the day finally arrived, Erica walked into the courthouse with a mix of emotions. Her mind wandered back to the judge's courtroom, to the coldness of his earlier judgment, and to the frustration she had felt. But now, as she approached the door to his office, she carried with her a sense of resolve. This meeting wasn't about letting go of the past. It was about building something new, a mutual understanding between two people on opposite sides of a complex system. Judge Morris was waiting for her when she arrived, standing by his desk with a genuine look of anticipation. His expression was different than the one she remembered in the courtroom, softer, more open, almost vulnerable. As Erica entered the room, he rose and extended a hand, his voice steady but full of warmth. "Miss Thompson," he said, his tone far more respectful than it had been that day in court. "Thank you for coming. I'm glad you accepted my invitation." Erica nodded, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you for reaching out, Judge Morris. It's not every day that someone in your position is willing to listen." They both sat down, and for the next hour, Erica shared her experiences, both personal and professional. She spoke of her work advocating for equal rights, her battles against systemic injustice, and the personal struggles she had faced within the very institutions she had worked so hard to change. Judge Morris listened intently, his eyes reflecting a deepening understanding. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the willingness to hear, to truly listen to one another. And in that moment, something shifted. The courtroom, once a place of rigid rulings and detached judgments, now seemed a little more human. The meeting between Erica Thompson and Judge Morris continued for over an hour. By the time they were wrapping up, there was a shared understanding between them that neither had anticipated when they first walked into the room. For Erica, it had been more than just an apology. It had been an invitation for change. And for Judge Morris, it had been an opportunity to view his role through a different lens, one that recognized the complexity of the people who came before him. As the conversation drew to a close, Erica leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Judge Morris, what I've seen in our justice system too often is a disconnect between the rules and the people those rules affect. I've spent my career trying to bridge that gap. The law, as you know, is vital, but it's the people who uphold it that make it real. That's what matters. It's not about giving up standards, but rather understanding the deeper context in which those standards are applied." Judge Morris nodded thoughtfully, his expression sincere. "You're right, Miss Thompson. I think I had become so absorbed in the structure of the law, in the black and white nature of it, that I lost sight of the people it serves. I won't say that I've completely figured out how to change my approach, but today has certainly opened my eyes. I want to be more than just a judge who hands down decisions without understanding what those decisions mean beyond the courtroom." Erica smiled, relieved to hear those words. That's all any of us can do. Be willing to learn and grow, especially when the consequences are so much larger than we realize. As the meeting ended, both of them felt a sense of closure, but also the beginning of something new. For Judge Morris, this conversation wasn't just about one case. It had sparked a shift in how he viewed justice itself. He knew that he couldn't undo his past decisions, but he could change how he approached his future rulings. His commitment to fairness would no longer be about applying the law without question. It would be about applying it with compassion and awareness. For Erica, the meeting wasn't just about getting an apology. It was about a larger conversation that had the potential to change the way justice was practiced. She knew that one conversation wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. It was a reminder that even in a system as entrenched as the judiciary, change could begin with a simple act of humility. As she walked out of the courthouse, Erica felt lighter than she had in weeks. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew the road ahead would still be long. But she had taken a step towards something important, a system that recognized people for who they were, not just what they represented. And that, she thought, was the kind of justice worth fighting for.